All right, I am in the car, as you can see, just outside of a massage appointment, and I have my book with me here reading, so I thought I'd just do this next one. It's really quick, and this one is step 4 of the rituals, or it's called the rituals, for Robert E. Johnson's book Inner Work. And I just saw this is the second to last chapter, so we're about done with the book. The next one is levels. It's a longer one. There'll probably be a couple videos, but for now, let's just keep going with this inner work. All right, step 4 of the rituals. To incarnate your active imagination means to give it a physical quality, to bring it off the abstract, rarefied level and connect it to your physical earthbound life. The 4th step of active imagination is much the same as the 4th step of dream work. This is no coincidence. We could state as a general principle that whenever you do any form of inner work and bring it to an insight or resolution, you should do something to make it concrete. Either do a physical ritual or, if appropriate, do something that will integrate it into the fabric of your practical daily life. Since we've discussed this step in the dream work section, we will not dwell on it at length here. You might reread the chapter on rituals, review the examples you find there, and apply them to your active imagination. Excuse me. There is one very important point that needs to be made regarding this 4th step. You must not act out. In psychological jargon, acting out means basically taking your inner subjective conflicts and urges and trying to live them out externally and physically. In extreme clinical situations, acting out may take the form of violence directed at oneself or other people. But most of us do a certain amount of mild acting out in our daily lives without being aware of it. For example, a man gets into a terrible conflict within himself over a decision he can't stand to make, so he bursts out in anger at his wife and tries to resolve it by having a fight with her. Active imagination presents opportunities for this because it draws up so much fantasy material. If this same man isn't careful, if he's arguing with his anima during active imagination, he will go and start up the same argument with his wife immediately afterwards. He will try to live out the imagination externally and literally. To incarnate your imagination during this 4th step does not mean to act out your fantasies in a literal way. It means rather to take the essence that you have distilled from it, the meaning, insight, or basic principle that you have derived from the experience, and incarnate it by doing physical ritual or by integrating it into your practical life. You can get into trouble and cause harm if you fail to make this distinction. You must not take this 4th step of active imagination as license to act out your fantasies in their raw, literal form. And going back really quickly to this whole point of how he, in his dream state, he argued or had a blowout with his anima, or a female figure in him, and then he went out and did that with his wife in the physical. It's not the actual person, the people that you would approach in your dream state, in your active imagination, and all of those things. It's not the actual person, it's a symbol, like everything is. It's a symbol of some kind of principle or dynamic or something that's going on in your inner world that you need to work out. So it's like if you have an argument with your inner feminine, who in your external world plays out as your wife, it's not that your wife and you have a conflict, it's that you have a conflict with your inner feminine self that you're kind of suppressing and needing to address. And so that's why it's not the same to go out and then try and live it out, because that's not the point. It's saying that there's other principles and things that need to be derived from the experience. And yeah, so the example earlier in the book with the one of the rituals that the person did was, I think it was eating a bunch of junk food or something, and then he went and physically got a burger and he buried it in the backyard. I'll find out which video it was and I'll probably put a link to it. But yeah, we went over this whole thing earlier in the book. I don't know if this is still recording. Hope so. I'm just going to keep going. When this principle comes up in extreme form, it is easy to see how true it is. For example, let us suppose that I'm doing active imagination and see myself in olden times fighting my enemies with a sword. This sword play may be a valid thing for me to do inwardly, but it's obvious that I may not incarnate this imagination by getting a sword and using it on people I'm angry with. But if the subject of the active imagination gets closer to everyday circumstances, it gets more difficult to see the distinction, and the temptation to act out the fantasy becomes stronger. For this reason, I emphasize that we should not use the images of external physical people in active imagination. You should not call to mind the image of your spouse, your friend, or your coworker at your job and start talking with that person in your imagination. If you do that, it puts you under extreme unconscious pressure to take up the active imagination physically when you're around that person again. You involuntarily confuse the level of imagination and the level of external physical relationship. You start doing things or saying things that make no sense to other people. After all, they haven't read the script. And that's going back to the last chapter where he says active imagination is not like those other kinds of practices where you're trying to manipulate the situation, where you're trying to create a role play or a script or something where you're trying to create an outcome that's something that you specifically want. And so you're trying to approach a certain person, rehearse that dialogue with them, which they say you really can do. So say you're going into a job appraisal or your your annual review, and you run it in your head with your boss beforehand, and then you go in there, you can actually kind of impact or how the situation turns out. But this is very different from that because you're not trying to actually manipulate your external world. You're actually dialoguing with your internal self and seeing what you need to fix, what you need to work on, and things like that. So don't use real people if you can avoid it, because it's hard to then distinguish between the two. The thing to do when the image of someone you know comes up in your imagination is to stop and change the appearance of the image. You can even do this as part of your dialogue. You can say, "Look, I don't know why, but you look exactly like the guy at the office that I'm mad at. Since I know that you're an energy system inside me, please change your appearance." My glasses keep sliding off my face. Since I know that you're an energy system inside of me, please change your appearance. I don't want to confuse what's inside me with a person who is outside of me. If you do this, the inner figure will almost always cooperate and alter his or her appearance. Then you can enter into your dialogue with a clear sense that you are talking with a part of yourself, not an external human being. There's also another reason why it's a bad idea to do active imagination using the image of someone you know in the outside world. It is what people used to call magic. It is clear from experience that what we do at the unconscious level is transmitted to the unconsciousness of people around us and involuntarily affect them. Even like I was just talking about with that scenario where you role play in your head, it totally does actually create an energetic exchange, and it kind of can influence the other person because you're shifting the dynamic of the energy by actually visualizing this stuff. It's a form of magic, and it's also an imposition on someone else if they're not kind of aware and able to balance out their own energetic states and what energy they're taking in versus what's their own. So it's saying that that's another reason why you don't do this, because it's considered magic, or a lesser form of magic where you're infringing on someone else, basically. Even when we're not around them physically, what we do in fantasy and imagination sends out vibrations through the collective unconscious that are felt by other people in their unconscious. Therefore, if you take up a tool as powerful as active imagination and focus all that energy in the unconscious on the image of a certain person, it begins to affect that individual. Even if your intentions are good, the results are simultaneously manipulative and uncontrollable. You can't predict exactly what the effects will be. The other person may feel a vague unconscious pressure and begin to behave differently toward you without understanding why. For the same reason, it is a mistake to allow yourself to fantasize a great deal about a person. In addition to being as useless as passive fantasy always is, it has a bad effect on the other person, on you, and on your relationship. If we get involuntarily caught up in recurring intense fantasies regarding an external person, we might be angry and so fantasize telling him or her off. We might take great satisfaction in going over all the sarcastic statements we will say to put the person to shame. Or we might fall in love and have a steady fantasy going in the back of the mind all day. How we will court the beloved, how things will turn out, how we will live in an exciting, passionate dream ever after. Don't just live in fantasy. Just if you have an impulse or a desire to say something to someone in the physical, I mean, it's great to like journal things out and get a written kind of idea of what your thoughts are so you can get clear. Clarity is super crucial, but don't kind of like create this whole fantasy dream world in your mind that you get so caught up in that you never act and take into account that the other person has their own role to play, their own input, their own ideas, their own values, their own response that they're going to give you that you're depriving yourself of by thinking that you can imagine out everything and dictate and control everything. That's not what it is. You have to surrender to the individual spark that's within each and every person, and you can't infringe upon them in that way. So don't waste your time role-playing and fantasizing even the negative stuff. If you have something to confront someone with, do it, and then, or you can write out a letter to them, just your side, your view, and then burn it, throw it away, crumple it up, do a ritual to just release that energy, that toxic energy. Because as you hold anger towards someone else, you're holding that inside of yourself and you're poisoning yourself. That's why they say forgiveness is more for you than it is for the other person, because you have to release that. And then they feel it release themselves, because we're all connected. So, almost done. I hope it's still recording. First, just as with active imagination, the running of continual fantasy through your mind regarding an external person inevitably affects the other person through the unconscious. Second, indulging in the fantasy has a bad effect on you, for it locks you into a certain mode with regard to the other person, just like we were saying. You become conditioned through successive repetitions of the fantasy to think about the other person in a certain way, to react automatically in a certain way. And this auto-conditioning may be completely inappropriate to the objective external situation. You get lost in this fantasy and you don't really even know how the other person actually feels, because you're so busy convincing yourself of how they feel or how they'll react or how things went down. And it's not the reality, because we see things through our own lens and our own filters. And sometimes it's so great to talk things out with another person, because you get their own perspective and another insight that can make you say, oh, hey, I get it now. I can understand more how you behaved in a certain way. So this inner world is so vast that we can create up all these things and imagine all these things, but it doesn't mean that it's always, right. You have to respect the outer world and you respect the inner world. It's always a balance. It's always a flow. Therefore, if you have strong inner feelings about an external person, whether positive or negative, it is best to begin by doing the inner work to discover what is going on subjectively within yourself. Then, if you have anything that needs to be said to the other individual, it's better to say it directly, using common sense and courtesy as your guide. Don't indulge in active imagination or a stream of fantasy using the image of that person. And above all, don't act your imagination out literally. The fourth step of active imagination is a two-edged sword. It is a necessity, but it must not be misused, or it can do more harm than good. At this stage, we need to use all the intelligence and common sense we can find within ourselves. We must do something physical, yet we may not act out projects on external people or be impudent and demanding with others. Finally, the fourth step cannot be separated from the third step, adding the ethical element, for it is your ethical sense that must set limits and be your guide in all that you do. All right, that's it. I think I recorded it, so it's done. Alrighty, I'll see you later. Take care.